Vast, calamitous explosion. Few of the overcoated shift workers struggling home along North Woolwich Road, London, on January 9th, 1917, paid much attention to a muffled explosion in a large factory near Crescent Wharf, Silvertown. The evening was cold and dull, and all were anxious for a cosy fire and a warm meal. 6 minutes later, a miniature sun blazed where the factory had stood. A gigantic explosion boomed over the city, and the sky rained fiery wreckage and lumps of metal. As night momentarily turned to day, thousands yelled that the Germans had shattered the city with a fearsome Zeppelin-launched weapon. That was the evening the Brunner chemical works, with its vast store of nitroglycerin, exploded. When rescue workers had dragged the last victim from the ragged circle of ruins about the factory, the casualty rate list totalled 69 blown to atoms or crushed to death, 4 dead, 94 seriously injured, and 328 slightly injured. No one knew what had caused the explosion, because few were aware that the Brunner works were manufacturing vast quantities of the deadly but notoriously unstable nitroglycerin. Used to make explosives for bullets, shells and bombs, Brunner nitroglycerin and TNT were of inestimable importance to the Allied war effort. In March 1915, the shortage of shells on the Western Front had flared into a public scandal. It resulted in the appointment of Lloyd George to take charge of the Ministry of Munitions, and undoubtedly laid the basis for the fall of the Asquith government in December 1916. The British had been slow to recognise the role of massed artillery in static trench warfare. Under the shocking conditions in France, the hungry guns soon starved. At the time Brunner Mons blew up, it was a key link in the British plan to build a vast reserve of ammunition. Women had flocked to it and similar factories to make explosives, bombs, shells and cartridges. The German submarine campaign was rapidly approaching its deadly peak. The big Allied offensive on all fronts had failed, and morale in the French and Russian armies was at a low ebb. Coming when it did, the Silvertown disaster did inestimable damage to the war effort. It was a chemical works, and at that the limited mind of the East Ender preferred to leave it. Those inside the walls knew better. From the vast array of vats and pipes, which wound about the workrooms like intestines of some impossible monster, poured explosives to feed the guns in France. Nitroglycerin, basis of cordite, dynamite and gelignite, lay stored in the factory's vats. A pale yellow oil, it is made by spraying glycerin into a mixture of nitric and sulfuric acid. Because of its sensitive nature, nitroglycerin is mixed with a solid base to make a practical explosive. When heated, it decomposes just before boiling and explodes with a devastating effect. Trinitroluene, TNT, was also brewed at Brunner Mons. In specially made rail trucks it went from the factory siding to France. To the Germans, the factory must have been a tempting target. Its destruction would do incalculable harm to the Allied war effort. On the fatal evening, the factory's chief chemist, Dr. Adrian Angel, was engrossed in an experiment in his laboratory. He straightened up in alarm when he heard the bang of a small explosion. It was 6:45 p.m. A watchman came panting into the room to report a fire near one of the melting pots on the top floor. He told Dr. Angel the blaze was spreading rapidly. Angel immediately telephoned the fire brigade. Only a few blocks down the street, 10 men and 10 women, mostly cleaners, were still in the factory. The women were ordered out, but the men stayed to help the chief chemist get the emergency fire hoses into action. Within 3 minutes of the alarm, flames poked fingers of fire through the factory roof. Within 3 minutes of the alarm, flames poked fingers of fire through the factory roof. In North Woolwich Road, the women workers looked at the growing glare and ran even harder. Within a few minutes, the first firemen were running out their hoses. Dr. Angel was everywhere, pointing out the danger spots, shouting orders, brushing aside pleas that he should now leave the fight to the firemen. The emergency hoses had been useless against the fire. Mysteriously it spread with amazing speed. Blazing timber flew as small batches of unrefined explosive flared or exploded. Dr. Angel, his clothing singed and smouldering in places, dashed through the flames to the huge vats where most of the nitroglycerin was stored. Shouting to make himself heard above the roar of flames, the chemist told firemen the vats had to be kept cool at all times. The fire continued to inch forward, and in the vats the temperature steadily rose. By 6:50 p.m. they were reflecting the glare from the nearest flames. Fire brigade reinforcements arrived and began connecting extra hoses. Outside, scores of curious East Enders, ignorant of the terrible danger, elbowed their fellows to get a better view of the already spectacular blaze at Brunner Mons. Few heeded the shouted warnings from the women running from the factory. At 6:51 p.m, Brunner Mons vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was a miniature sun, shooting its tremendous glare over the city of London. For those fighting the fire, the explosion meant nothing. 1 second they were alive, vital humans doing duty in the face of death. The next they did not exist. Those in the 6 acres smashed by the blast heard a roar beyond power of human description. Their homes collapsed, killing them instantly or leaving them to suffocate in the ruins. 30 miles away, people saw the brilliant flame jump into the sky and later heard the muted boom. At King's Lynn, Norfolk, 87 miles from the catastrophe, windows tinkled to fragments. Everything about the factory, for a radius of 400 yards, was flattened. A little beyond, where the blast lost some of its power, the upper stories of homes were whipped off and reduced to so many bricks and matchwood. Dead lay in misshapen heaps on the roads, while the injured moaned for help. Scores who rushed to their doors at the first flash were struck down by blast or debris. The explosion lifted a 3-ton boiler from the factory basement and hurled it into a field a quarter of a mile away. From throughout the Silvertown district came harrowing tales of death and disaster. Some escaped death by inches. Others were struck down in freakish circumstances. One woman, who ran from her home in alarm when she learned the factory fire was spreading, met the full blast of the explosion in her doorway. Her child was torn from her arms, and the house collapsed, burying the child and stunning the mother. When she recovered, she began to claw at the rubble in a desperate search for her child. Shortly after midnight, rescue workers found her unconscious in a crazy tunnel burrowed in the ruins. Her hands were ripped to shreds, and 4 fingers had been broken in her frantic clawing. The child lay beside her, dead. Rescuers who bravely struggled to free the injured used doors, shutters, broken beds and barrows as emergency stretchers. Doctors, accompanied by nurses, amputated trapped limbs on the spot. There were many unsung heroes that night. More than 500 people were treated in the streets by doctors. Serious cases, where possible, were rushed to hospitals. The first streaks of dawn revealed an incredible shambles. Troops who helped clear the area said the horrors of trench warfare in France paled to insignificance beside the Silvertown disaster. It was days before some families were reunited. Shocked children found wandering aimlessly about the ruins were cared for by kindly strangers and government officials. In some cases it was weeks before the parents were located, if ever. For weeks Londoners debated the Great Blast. The possibility of sabotage was freely discussed. In the public mind, at least, it was no accident. The official report of the Home Secretary was made more than 2 months after the explosion. It called attention to the gallant conduct of Dr. Angel, George Wenborn, the leading male hand on duty at the factory, and Police Constable Greenough, who had been on duty outside the works. Rescuers found Dr. Angel's shattered body 6 days after the blast. It could be identified only by a fragment of the shirt he was wearing at the time. Officially, the cause of the fire at Brunner Mons was listed as unknown. However, the report went on to say the possibility of sabotage had not been overlooked. Whatever its cause, the great explosion at Silvertown lived long in the memories of the fortunate survivors. Its destruction must have lengthened the war by depriving the Allies of desperately needed munitions. The breathing space it gave the Germans must have been beyond calculation in value.